Geert Wilders has stalked the Dutch political theatre for decades without making any significant breakthrough. But that changed this week as the charismatic populist, who's known for his tough talk on immigration and Islam, won the highest number of seats in the general election. Whether he'll become Prime Minister is still to be determined, but in the words of the BBC, his victory has spooked Europe. How high can the populist tide rise? To answer that, I'm joined by pollster and political scientist Matt Goodwin. Hello, Matt. Welcome back to GB News. What did you make of Geert Wilders' performance in itself? How well did he do? To what extent was that unexpected?
Well, good morning, Michael. He did very well. It was a surprise for most of the commentariat in the Netherlands. But of course, we should remember that the rise of Geert Wilders has been 20 years in the making. The Dutch have been voting for populists since people like Pim Fortuyn in the early 2000s. They've had a more recent wave of populism in the 2010s. But nothing like this. This is a sort of peak, if you like, for Wilders. And it comes against the backdrop of two things, Michael, which I think are critical. One is an ongoing refugee crisis in Europe, which we still don't have a resolution to. And the second, obviously, is the Israel-Gaza conflict and the protests, the pro-Palestine, in some cases pro-Hamas protests that have been taking place in many European cities. Both of those things, I think, have helped Wilders and have really given him this record result.
Very interesting. Now, do you want to broaden this out to Europe? What are the parallels elsewhere? And can we detect, as it were, a movement, a trend?
Well, I think we can, Michael. I wrote a book in 2018 called National Populism, in which I argued that these movements were going to become permanent players in Western democracies. And that essentially is what we are seeing. Really, for those viewers with long memories, they'll remember people like Jean-Marie Le Pen, they'll remember people like Jörg Haider, they'll remember people like Umberto Bossi. Really from the 1990s, this movement of national populism, which prioritizes the interests and the culture of the nation against what it argues is a corrupt or self-serving elite, has been gaining strength in most Western democracies. So look around Europe today at the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the most popular party in Eastern Germany, the most popular party among men, National Populists in Austria back to being at the top of the polls, Giorgia Meloni running Italy, Vox in Spain doing reasonably well, Chega in Portugal breaking through, the Sweden Democrats essentially running Sweden's government from behind the scenes. So these movements are very significant, are very strong, Michael. And, you know, what's interesting about Britain, by the way, is that we are now one of the only democracies in Europe not to have one of these very successful populist movements. And, you know, from where I'm sat, Michael, the thing I would say is what all of this shows is, I think, the failure of established parties to really respond to the concerns that are driving voters into the arms of these parties. I mean, we're nearly 10 years on now from the votes for Brexit, the votes for Donald Trump, you know, and still we've got unresolved public concerns over migration, unresolved public concerns over law and order, unresolved public concerns over what's happening to the cultural left in our politics, which is increasingly radical. And these parties will just keep getting stronger and stronger unless the reasons people are voting for them are actually addressed.
And why then do parties, the established parties on the centre-right in Europe, why did they not respond better? What is holding them back? Why don't they occupy at least part of the ground that is shifting over to these populist parties?
Well, I think we've seen two things going on, really, Michael. The first is parties on the left are basically, in my view at least, incapable of really addressing these concerns over migration and borders and security, because ultimately they view them as being somehow racist, which is really reflecting how far left today's left has gone. But the second thing, I think, which is difficult for the established parties, if we're being honest with viewers and we're being honest with voters, is that they can't control these issues anymore. They've either handed too much power and authority up to organizations like the European Union, or they've outsourced power and authority to regulatory industries and agencies that aren't directly accountable to people. And so they haven't really got that control over those issues that they used to have. And partly that's been exacerbated, we must remember, by some of the disastrous policies people in power have pursued. I mean, the reality, for example, of our refugee crisis is that was partly stoked by our disastrous interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, our inability to stabilize Northern Africa, our inability to find a political consensus in dealing with that challenge, and deciding what we want to do in terms of defending our borders. So I think overall, the established parties have been struggling for a number of reasons. And so populists, I was just looking at the polling before coming on this show, Michael, populists in a lot of these countries are now getting higher than they've ever been before. I mean, even in the US, we tend to forget this, but Trump is now polling ahead of Joe Biden, ahead of that 24 general election. And we've got a massive set of elections next year, Michael, across all of the European Parliament. We've got we're going to have elections that will determine who represents people in the European Parliament. So that none of this is going anywhere anytime soon unless we can actually address those grievances.
At the beginning of this, you talked about the British exceptionalism, that we don't really have this tendency going on in this country. I suppose we did, but we released the pressure by having the Brexit referendum. So I would argue that actually if you give people the chance to express themselves, that could be one way in which you can puncture the populist bubble. I'd also suggest that the first past the post system makes it much more difficult for these sorts of parties to gain a foothold.
I think that's right, Michael. I think in the 1950s, there was a very famous book called The Civic Culture by two academics who argued that the reason Britain didn't do extremist radical politics like the Germans and the Italians was that we had a political culture that prioritized things like consensus, tolerance, pluralism. We didn't like messianic figures. We certainly didn't like anybody that seemed to be violating our commitment to democracy. Now, of course, Brexit did, as you say, become an outlet for some of that. What worries me, though, today, Michael, is that while that did release some pressure in the system, as we saw this week with the new migration numbers, I'm concerned about the fact that both Labour and the Conservatives now have sort of decided to put pressure back into the system by not doing what many Brexit voters thought they were going to get when they voted for Brexit, mainly lower levels of migration. We saw those numbers this week, net migration now 672,000, meaning 672,000 more people came into the country than left. And what worries me, Michael, is that Brexit release valve that you rightly point to. I wanted that to be permanent. I didn't want it just to be for a few years. And what worries me today is that we seem to have leaders who are determined to take us back into that politics of populism and polarization and division by not giving the British people what they want. And lastly, Michael, I polled them this week. I'll give you one figure. When I gave British voters those migration numbers, 54% nationally said these numbers are too high, and over 70% of Conservative voters said these numbers are too high. So there is one little seed that may yet grow into yet another populist rebellion. So watch this space.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Matt Goodwin, for drawing together all the strands across Europe.